Time flies over us, but leaves its shadow behind. That's a famous quote from the author Nathaniel Hawthorne, and it beautifully captures how time can move so continuously and yet leave a trail in our memories that continues to shape us. This month will be the 3rd anniversary of my wife Sarah's passing, and the shadow cast by her death has been a long one for me. Grief ebbs and flows, and this podcast has just been one way for me to try to process it all. Hey everyone, I'm Larry Home, and it's hard to believe a year has flown by since we started the What About Grief podcast. I honestly wasn't sure if we'd even make it to a 1-year episode. After the trailer was released, I thought, who's going to listen to a podcast on grief? Maybe it was too tough a subject to discuss even. After some research early on, I realized that people are speaking more and more about the topic, though. And there's a whole range of options out there for those who need help understanding, coping, and living with their grief. And I had hoped this podcast would be one of those options. And so here we are. This episode is celebrating the 1-year launch. It will be a look back at some of the great advice, perspectives, fearlessness, and vulnerability from my guests that have continued to surprise and move me over the past 12 months. So, no interview this month, but my voice won't be the only one you will hear. My awesome producer, Marcia Anderson, is joining me to help tee up the clips you are about to hear from the past year of guests and discussion. I couldn't have made it to the 1-year anniversary show without Marcia.
Hi, everyone.
That's Marcia. Now, what you guys don't know about Marcia was during the heyday of the Oprah Winfrey Show, Marcia was a producer, and now she's producing this podcast. So, Marcia, your career is officially over.
No, but it is something that I did learn probably from working on the show, and that was that when someone you know, a friend, needs help after going through something, you should actually do. You should not say, let me know if you need anything. Right?
You jumped in.
And so this feels like it's, this is what I'm doing.
And the pay's awesome.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. I don't pretend to be the expert on grief. Far from it. Heck, I'm still learning so much, as I hope you are all as well. My main goal with this podcast is to honor my wife Sarah's life and to help others understand the journey that is grief by reminding you that you are never alone. Before we get to the year in review, a note of thanks to you, the listeners. Thank you all. And to those who have emailed or told me in person that this podcast has been helpful to your dealings with grief, that means the world to me, and I really do thank you.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
And special thanks to my guests. I am deeply grateful you were so generous in sharing your time, stories, and wisdom with us. Oh, and 2 quick notes. Please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave a comment on the Apple Podcast app. All this helps grow the podcast. And we're going to take the month of August off, but we will be back in September with a new episode. All right, let's begin. Marcia, when we first got started, I told you how I wanted my first podcast guests to be 2 people who played an important role in my own grief journey, and that was Mary and Erin.
Right. They're the mother and daughter team, and they were the leaders of the grief share group that you joined soon after Sarah passed away. And I remember actually being so glad you had found them. To me, it seemed like it would probably be helpful to be in a group situation with other people who had experienced loss or were on their own grief journeys.
Totally right. Mary and Erin were more than well aware of how grief works and what coping strategies would be helpful. You know, their own story of how the tragic death of Carrie, their daughter and sister, led them to volunteer to help others with the process of grief, which was a real inspiration to me to take the leap myself and to join a group.
I know when you and I have talked about this, we both agreed that one of the more important issues surrounding grief in our culture is that people don't like to talk about it. So here's what Mary and Erin had to say when you asked them why that is.
I think, first of all, it makes people uncomfortable. And, when you're on the receiving end, you hear a lot of platitudes. They think they're being helpful, but they're not. They're hurtful. And what we found, and the advice I give any chance I can now, is people don't say anything because they don't know what to say. And I will say to that person, then just say, I don't know what to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think people, too, are so afraid of causing you pain by bringing up the loss. And it's like, I've already experienced it. Like, I'm living in it. So don't hesitate for a second to talk to me about it. Because I think talking about it is so healing.
Yeah, I like when people bring up Sarah. It's therapeutic for me. And physically, she's not here, but she lives on in so many people, obviously. Her personality, her smile, and it's a favorite topic of mine to
Absolutely.
talk about. And I'm sure you all obviously like to speak about Carrie and also started a foundation in her name. So her legacy lives on, no doubt.
I think when people share stories of your loved one, too, you learn different things about them because everybody's had a different experience or a different relationship with your loved one. So to be able to still learn new things about your loved one, even after they've passed, I mean, that is such a gift.
They were a great start, and so was former LPGA star and current NBC Sports TV analyst and friend Morgan Pressel, who was just 15 years old when she lost her mother to breast cancer. And I've got to say, I really appreciated her openness and honesty when she shared her story on how she has coped since then. I asked her after all these years, had she even given herself permission to finally grieve openly and honestly? And here's what she said.
I don't know the answer. And I don't know what, I guess, dealing with grief looks like. And I think it looks different for everybody. And
Definitely.
I kind of, when I think about it, I think about that I have tried to grieve by doing, in the sense of starting a foundation and trying to raise money to help others battling breast cancer. And I truly think in at its core, that's a way, and my grandfather helped me create that. So I think between the two of us, that was our way of grieving, is we can't just sit around and, feel sorry for ourselves. Why did this happen to me? Granted, I've had many of those thoughts in my life. Why her? Why so young? All of those questions have, come in and out so many times. But, I think we kind of looked at it and said, okay, we can't change the past, but what can we really do about the future?
Larry, for me, the line from her that was unforgettable was that it's okay to feel sad. And it's that's something that's important for people to know.
Agree. Back in 2022, as the one-year anniversary of Sarah's death approached, I found myself thinking a lot about how was I going to spend that day? This podcast offered a chance for me to ask others how they remember their loved ones on that difficult day. And my fraternity brother, Doug Hoffpower, who lost his son, Zach, at the age of 26, had a great answer.
I post something, whatever his birthday, it's either his birthday or the day that he died.
Mm-hmm.
And such great things that people say.
I do that too. And it's good for me. It's healing for me. And I think, people are going to be tired of seeing these remembrances of Sarah's birthday or her passing. But you know what? It to your point, it's the exact opposite. People loved Sarah, they loved Zach, and they're still in their lives. And these little reminders once or twice a year is therapeutic for us all, I think.
Well, and for you, I wish I would have known your wife. And I know you probably hear that a lot. I hear it a lot about Zach. And,
sure. And
guess what? Sad to say, but if she didn't die, if Zach didn't die, would I have known much about her? Would you know much about Zach? Probably not.
Yeah.
So there is a bright side to all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Death is horrible. It hurts us. It's crazy how everyone left on earth has to deal with this. We are here for a short time, all of us. So, but it's something we have to get through, and I do appreciate you reaching out to me, and I do appreciate you letting me say what I need to say. And this helps me too. And I'm sure, like I said, talking about Sarah for you, I'm sure it helps you too. And I do appreciate you reaching out.
Just listening to Doug talk about his son, Zach, you can feel the love, the affection, the great memories that go right alongside the pain. It's a good reminder, actually, of how there's no loss without love. So, Larry, when we first started mapping out the podcast, we both knew there was one topic we had to talk about.
Yep.
And that was the dreaded holiday season. A time that's rough going for anyone struggling with grief. We were looking for expert advice, coping strategies, anything that would help. Lucky for us, you found an article by Professor Suzanne Deggs-White in Psychology Today on this very topic, and she agreed to join us. First up, we wanted to know what specifically makes the holidays so hard for people who have lost someone.
The holidays are so hard for people who have lost someone for the same reasons they're so amazing for people who are surrounded by family. It's because of the import and the emphasis we place on holidays. It's because of the specialness we imbue the holidays with, and because of all those traditions that your family associates with the holidays. Whatever they are, the idea of the holidays conjures up so many images, so many feelings, that when we take away that most important person, it's like the holidays don't just seem empty, they seem almost like a cruel trick.
Early on in my first go-around with the holidays after Sarah's death, I was looking for any kind of tips on how to honor our loved ones during the holiday seasons. And once again, the professor delivered some great advice.
When you lose a partner, you don't want to erase them from your lives. You want to find a way to carry their memory forward. And so what are things you enjoy doing with your partner? Continue to do those things. If it's, if you've lost a parent and they always had a certain seat at the table or preferred a certain, whether it's a blessing or prayer or a meal, carrying on with those things and honor the person can help you feel like that person is still there, because that person's memory and that person's presence in your life will always be there, just in different ways. Doing something, some kind of charity act, donating to a charity that the person who is gone appreciated, doing the things that they took value in, especially at the holidays. That's something you can do. If there's someone special that, they always connected with at the holidays, make sure you still stay connected to that person in honor of the person you lost. Some of the simple things, lighting a candle, going to a particular service. If, faith was an important part of the person you've lost life, doing the things that honor them and get you involved in life, kind of engaging in life still, rather than looking at the holidays as something you want to, cover your head November 1st and not come out until January 31st. Not allowing yourself to do that, because that's a disservice to the memory and your partner.
Her advice was so helpful, and I re-listen to this episode anytime a holiday approaches.
No, that was a good one.
Over time, and with each subsequent guest, one thing started to stand out for me, and that was the role memory plays in any grief journey. And our guest, Dr. Mary Lamia, a clinical psychologist, professor, author, she's a blogger, and she is just an expert in this area. But before I even got to ask her about memories and grief, she gave us just a really great definition of what grief actually is.
Yeah, we think of grief as an emotion, but is it really? I mean, technically, biologically, emotions are immediate, they're reflexive, but emotions can also be repeatedly activated, and those create a mood or a state. And grief is a state or mood. And so, an emotional state often has two or more primary emotions that are co-assembled or blended together. That's true of anxiety or jealousy or love or disappointment or loneliness and grief. So grief involves distress or anguish, a more intensely felt version of distress, combined with other emotions. The anguish can combine with shame or with anger or with fear. It can produce a state that feels very sad or very agitated. So, I mean, grief has a lot of faces.
You know, Larry, I really liked how she addressed your question that that your current memory is mostly of Sarah when she was sick.
Yeah.
And she also pointed out it gave a really good piece of advice about how people can deal with lost future memories. Those are like, memories you're never going to have that you were hoping to create with your loved one.
Lost dreams.
Lost dreams.
About.
Yeah.
Yes, the lost dreams are difficult because it's though we have to revise our future plans. And so that's prospective memory, what we anticipate in the future or plan for. And that's a process of just of letting go of sorts, of recognizing that we won't be able to realize those goals, those plans. Memory is it's so linear, that you expect when you have a future plan, things are going to go along and this is how it's going to be. And it's just a matter of time going by where you make those revisions. Time is very important when it comes to grief and how we revise our plans and how we revise our lives. And time is healing in some ways, and time gives us perspective because we're constantly reminded, oh, we're not going to take that trip. We're not going to do that thing.
Yeah.
But it does feel so, it's hard because it's almost like you keep remembering you were going to do that thing and you keep knowing that you have to give it up.
After reading an article about how Hall of Fame quarterback Jim Kelly from the Buffalo Bills lost his 8-year-old son, Hunter, in 2005 to a terminal illness, I knew I wanted to hear him tell this story. So when he joined us on the podcast, I asked Jim how he was able to balance grieving the loss of Hunter while still providing a happy life for his 2 daughters. And here's what he had to say.
Oh, you know what? It was tough, but I'm very good at putting negativity to the side. I mean, maybe that's because being a quarterback, you throw an interception, you got to forget about, learn from it. When you lose, you got to, learn from it. You put it to the side. And I always was able to do that. I always try to focus my mind on positive stuff and not negative stuff. I don't try to let it wear me down. And I always kept busy. And that's probably why I ran the no-huddle offense. I was fast. I kept on moving. And I was able to do it. But, having my 2 daughters now in my life is such a blessing. I mean, my oldest daughter is married now. She's been married for 5 years. No grandchildren yet. Unfortunately, she's going through some tough times with Lyme disease, and she caught probably hunting with me by a tick.
Oh, my.
But, and then my youngest daughter is a senior. She's a first year grad school at Liberty University. So I'm very blessed. I have a beautiful wife, 2 great daughters, and a son-in-law. So it was hard at the beginning to see all the things they were going through, but they were young when Hunter was here. So it didn't affect them as much as it does now when they look back and saw what all the things that Hunter had to go through.
In my own experience, loneliness has been a reoccurring challenge. I've had to adjust to living my daily life and doing most things now as a single person. And that continues to take time.
So it was actually really helpful. We had Drs. Louise Hockley and Dr. Wendy Lichtenthal, 2 experts in loneliness as our guests. And the first thing Louise did was define the difference between the state of being alone and loneliness.
Yes, that's a good question. And you alluded to it when you were talking about the dark days of February and how it can feel isolating because you do tend to cocoon yourself. There's not much going out. But that's being alone. And loneliness is feeling alone. And I think you're not alone in having experienced loneliness. Everybody's probably experienced it at some point in their life. And ironically, it has very little to do with who's around you or not around you. It's how you feel in that social context, whether it's alone or with other people. And a lot of people will attest to the fact that feeling that way when you're around other people is excruciating. You kind of expect it when you're alone. But if you're around other people and you don't feel like you connect with them, like you belong, that's lonely making in the most unpleasant way. I would also add that isolation, although it has its own cost, is not necessarily a bad thing. People choose isolation in the sense that they choose solitude. They choose to have time alone because that time can itself be restorative. It can be a time to be creative. Whereas being lonely, almost by definition, it's not a choice. It's unpleasant. You would rather not be. The unfortunate thing is, and we might get into this, but the unfortunate thing is when you're lonely, you can get caught up in a bit of a cognitive loop and not see that, in fact, you are contributing to your own loneliness, that there are things you can do to get out of that loneliness loop.
A really good definition. And early on, I know in my own grief, I noticed that I could be at a party or around a lot of people, and I would just want to get the heck out of there and go home. And Wendy explained the reason why.
When you're out in public and you are trying to connect, you may not be sharing all that you did as you did at the start of this discussion, which was kind of naming the truth of what you were feeling. And when we're in social situations, especially for those who are grieving, trying to figure out how to connect might mean pushing down the truth of what you're really feeling. Missing, for example, Sarah being there by your side and kind of having the face you put on very much different than what you're feeling internally. And that's an uncomfortable place to be. It's exhausting. It's a lot of work. So that's at least one reason you might want to get out of that situation. The other reason is because people say stupid things sometimes, right?
Yes,
They say,
yes. How are you doing, Larry?
Fine, I'm awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah.
Right. So that part of it where it could feel like a misattunement or that you're trying to make other people feel comfortable in their misstep of what they say. Again, a lot of work and not feeling connected. So wanting to get out of a situation where you're putting on a face and working in that way, where you're trying to not react authentically to something someone said that was really off, a real misstep, makes a lot of sense. So even though you would think being around people could feel better, if they aren't connecting with you, they don't know what you're really feeling, and you don't feel comfortable sharing that truth the way you opened up today, it's not going to feel great. And the alternative of being by yourself, where you can be authentic, would feel better. So it makes a lot of sense that you'd want to get out of there.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's a nice way of putting another color onto the definition of loneliness. It has very little to do with the number of people you're around. It's really tied to the quality of your relationships or interactions. Mm-hmm. And if it's not authentic, it's going to be dissatisfying and lonely making.
One of the things I've found is that grief changes you in the most substantial way. And when we had Kim Witzak on, she knows this better than most. Her husband, Woody, suffering side effects from an antidepressant that he was prescribed off-label for insomnia, committed suicide at age 37.
Yeah, Kim's story is heroic. It made no sense to her that Woody would take his own life. So she set out on a mission to uncover the truth of what happened. And as a result, she channeled her grief into making sure that a medication's potential side effects were disclosed so that no one else would ever have to learn about them after the fact the way that she did.
Yeah, and her dedication is really inspiring. And today she works in global drug safety advocacy. And by fighting for a stronger FDA and drug safety system, she honors Woody in a really profound way. And I asked her what he would think of her crusade for drug safety.
I have thought about it a lot because, it's funny. before Woody died, he always talked about, Kim, let's go they're going to put 2 cell phone towers in our neighborhood. And I'm like, no, Wood, are you kidding me? You're never going to win city council and cell phone companies. And he goes, I'd rather try like hell and lose than do nothing at all. And I feel like he's kind of laughing, and I'm still going to beat the crap out of him when I see him in heaven one day, because I'm like, here, you left me with one of the biggest drug companies in the world, and you left me. And I think he would be, and I will get like, this question always gets me emotional, because I think he'd be really proud of who I am and who I've become. And I wish that this person, I wish I could see him and have this conversation with him face to face, because I'm a different person today because of him, and he gave me this gift.
I gotta say, Marcia, after listening to Kim's episode, don't get in her way.
She is a woman on a mission.
Yeah, she is. I gotta admit, I haven't read a children's book in quite some time, but Grief is an Elephant by our guest Tamara Ellis Smith really spoke to me with its timeless, beautiful message and imagery that helps children who are experiencing grief.
Grief is heavy at any age, but for kids, there are extra challenges. And her book is such a great resource. Tam shared with us how she developed this idea of showing grief as it evolves, and it's taking the shape of different sized animals. It was really lovely.
That's a great question. So when I originally sent it to my agent, who then sent it to who would become my editor, I only had the elephant and the firefly. The whole story was about grief as this large, making it hard to breathe kind of entity in this little girl's life. And then she transforms it toward the end of the story into a firefly. My editor, or my editor-to-be, she hadn't bought the book yet, said to me, what if you played around with some other animals? What if you sort of filled in that continuum from elephant to firefly? What would that look like? What would those animals be? Would you be willing to give that a try? And the minute she said that, I felt like, yes, that makes sense. Grief is so many different things. It is a gradual process that goes in many different directions. Like all of that lended itself well to this, menagerie of animals that could represent it. And so I got right to work on doing that.
Following that up, we also had childhood trauma and grief expert Dr. Julie Caplow join us. And I asked her to explain how children grieve in comparison to adults.
I think oftentimes as adults, we do make the mistake of assuming that children grieve in the exact same way that adults do, but that's actually usually not the case. And in fact, with children, what we see is sort of approaching the grief and then moving away from the grief. And not that adults don't do that either, but with children, it's much more obvious. So in other words, a 5-year-old may have lost her father and 1 minute is crying and missing daddy and talking about that openly. And the next minute she's playing with her dolls or running around outside. And someone who saw her in that moment might assume, well, wow, she's really not grieving at all. But actually, that is how kids grieve. It's sort of that approach and then moving away and approaching again. And another big difference is also how children make sense of death. And we know that there are some really important developmental differences in how children view death. So for example, for toddlers or preschoolers, they may sense that the person is gone, but they often believe that death is reversible. So they're anticipating that the person is going to come back. And they have not necessarily grasped that the person is not coming back physically. Whereas older children, especially, once they get to adolescence, do understand the permanence of the loss. And for that reason, we tend to see maybe more severe symptoms of depression or even post-traumatic stress in that age group because they understand that this is a permanent loss.
We heard from a lot of you listeners that the one topic that you all really wanted to hear a little bit more about was guilt and regret. And I know I did as well. And anyone who is grieving has probably experienced some degree of either guilt, regret, or even a combination of the two. And what is the actual difference and why does it matter, right? So our guest was Litza Williams from whatsyourgrief.com, and she had a really helpful take.
I'll preface this by saying there is not one consistent definition that is used across
Sure.
the mental health space for things like guilt and regret and shame and all these different related topics. But for me, I think the really important distinction is that we often feel guilt when we look back at things where we made a mistake, we feel we harmed someone, we did something in a way that involved an intentionality, where we knew at the time that what we were doing either could cause harm, could potentially cause harm, might not be consistent with our values, and yet we did it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And regret is something that comes up when we look back and we are devastated by the outcome of something. We wish that we had done something differently. We wish that something had turned out differently. But when we look back, we realize we were doing the best we could with what we had at the time. We didn't have the intention to cause harm. We maybe didn't have knowledge or information that would have allowed us to make a different type of decision. Or, it was simply that we had no control over that situation. And in those cases, when we look back, what we're feeling is often deep regret about what happened. But it's a little bit different than that guilt that has some of that intentionality about who our past self was and what we were doing at the time.
I thought it was also interesting to hear Litza's take on a regret that you have about not talking more with Sarah about her thoughts on her fight with cancer, how she felt about death. And it was something that when you would describe this stuff to me, it didn't even occur to me. Here's what Litza had to say.
We want to open up space when people are sick or dying for them to be able to share those things. And also, some people who are sick and dying don't want to share those things. They want to focus on survival. They want to focus on the positive. They aren't in a space. And so we often have to take our cues from them and honor the way that they are going through their own process and journey. And in the place that you're in now, I think the thing that can be important is to recognize the guilt or regret that you feel about it now, but also try to have some self-compassion for who past Larry was then. Like, what were the reasons maybe that was hard, to try to really empathize with who you were in that moment, what was happening, and how you see it differently now from this moment looking back. But then use all of that information to go, okay, and now how does this inform me going forward? What will this mean when it comes to the time of my own death, or having another family member or friend who is in the place Sarah was? How will I use what I've learned from that, in memory of her, as part of her legacy, to say, wow, I didn't do it in exactly the way I wish I had with her. And that's going to help me to hopefully do it better the next time.
So, Larry, you've shared how much easier it feels for you to be surrounded by people who are also grieving, like your grief group.
I totally agree that there's something very comforting about being with others with similar situations. You can just be yourself and they totally understand you and there's no judgment. And so our most recent guest was Jenna Rogers, who works at Faith's Lodge, which is a retreat that helps families who have lost a child.
Jenna lost her son at 11 months, and she realized the importance of community in her own grief. And she now works at Faith Lodge to help others find hope in similar circumstances.
Yeah, and so we asked her about some of the common emotions and feelings parents experience after they've lost a child.
I mean, anger, blame, guilt. I mean, such profound sadness and depression, I think, and just confusion. There's so many emotions because everything in your whole world changes. And everything you do now is challenging. Like, it was really hard for me personally to even go to the grocery store after, because I feared I would run into somebody and they would want to talk about it. And maybe I didn't want to talk about it. So I wouldn't go to the grocery store. I feared strangers asking me how many children I had, or when I got pregnant with my second son, if that was my first. You know, it's like, there's so many, it never ends. And there's so many questions that you need to dodge, and you need to figure out how you're going to answer. And depending on how you choose to answer, then maybe you feel guilty if you didn't tell them that you had another child who passed away. But then if you do tell them, it's awkward for everybody.
Yeah.
It's sort of this no-win situation. But I think there's so many emotions and feelings, and I think they last for a very long time. I think some last forever, and some fizzle out. And some, just like grief, it comes and it goes.
Yeah.
It's not this linear line. It's this, it's all over the place. It's up and down and all around. And you can have, weeks and months of feeling okay. And then all of a sudden something hits you like a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
And you can feel that weight again. And then you kind of move through that. And then, so it's just all these different parts of life, the different paths that you're taking. And so it just changes along the way.
Larry, she also echoed how comforting it was to be around people who had also experienced loss, kind of echoing what you'd said. Faith Lodge gave her that. And it reminded me how similar it was to your own experience with your grief group.
I think grief is so isolating. And again, nobody knows what you're feeling except for you. You're the only person that knows what you're feeling or what it's like, to lose that specific person. And so then the next step out is those that have also lost that, significant person, a spouse, a child, a sibling. And so I think we naturally find comfort in people who are like us. And that's how, we develop friendships.
Yeah.
And so it transitions into grief that same way, is that you hold this major common tragedy and you're the only people who understand what it's like. And so you can't, because I do think it's hard to talk about it every day with your family and your friends and coworkers or whoever else might be in your life. There's this, I don't know, somewhere along the lines, you feel like I can't just continue to talk about this every day, that people might be annoyed, or people, don't want to talk about it, but they're going to listen because they're going to be nice. So you just get to share whatever it is that you're feeling, and that feeling of isolation just lifts and you're no longer alone in it.
I'd like to close out this 1-year anniversary episode as we started it with a quote. This one from Mark Lemon, who I have quoted before on the podcast. When I read it, I thought of you, the listeners, because I admire you as you seek out help to better understand and live with your grief. Whether it be this podcast, a book, a therapist, or whatever means helps you move forward, I really applaud you. So here's the quote. Today, someone asked me what inspires me. After a pause, I replied, people that have experienced great setbacks in their life, but still find the courage to carry on. This inspires me, and this fills me with the fight to wake up each morning and face the day. So if you're reading this and you too have struggled, but still find the courage to carry on each morning, you inspire me. My thanks to all of you for listening. What About Grief is available monthly on all major podcast listening platforms. please follow the podcast as well as rate and review the show on Apple Podcast. The executive producer of What About Grief is Marcia Anderson. Logo artwork was designed by TED Studios. This episode was recorded at BAM Studios in Chicago. And lastly, feel free to email us at whataboutgriefpod@gmail.com.